and welcome to Disruptive by Design. In this episode, we're going to discuss with two experts how to combat disinformation without compromising speech rights. And we're looking at measures, First Amendment friendly measures that institutions or organizations can take right now in their combating of misinformation and disinformation. And today I have with me Andy Norman and John Gilligan. Andy, let's start with you. Could you briefly introduce yourself and tell us about your current role in the work you're doing? Thanks.
Well, thanks, Kim. My name's Andy Norman. I'm the author of a book called Mental Immunity. It's about how people spot and shed problematic ideas and information. And it's led me to found an institute devoted to the science of immunity to mis and disinformation. So that's my focus right now. And let me turn things over to John.
Okay, Andy, thanks. And Kim, glad to be able to join you. So I'm John Gilligan. I'm the president and chief executive officer of the Center for Internet Security. We're a nonprofit organization that provides best practices developed by community consensus. One of the focus areas that we have is to support state and local, tribal and territorial organizations with cybersecurity support. And it's in this role in particular that has caused us to address the mis and disinformation topic. And I can discuss a little bit what we've done and what we've done more recently in this area as well.
Right, sure. Can you both start out by saying, and John, maybe if you could go first, kind of what's, in your view, the evolution of misinformation, disinformation? What have you seen over the last couple of years relative to, times before?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's important for our audience to keep in mind the rapid evolution of technology, of use of, in particular, social media, but really all internet-based communications and communications in general, which has evolved tremendously. And we've moved from reliance on really journalists and newspapers and television to a lot of reliance on social media. And coming with that has been the rise of really peers being able to create their own news and to edit and comment. And so that's really the trend that has given rise to mis and disinformation. And again, some cases it's intentional. In some cases, it's just out of ignorance. And the challenge has been, this has started to become very problematic. And the reason is people rely sometimes on information that is incorrect to their detriment, whether it's financial detriment, health detriment, et cetera. And so that's really the origin. And I think that what some of us who have been talking about this have been talking about an evolution. And the evolution was, initially there was chaos, and that's, where we were 4 and 5 years ago. And when Andy, started his activities, it was just, everybody was trying to do the right thing, but saying we needed to do something about this mis and disinformation. And what came next was we said, well, what needs to be done is to do content moderation. We need to take things down. We need to correct things. We got to get it all right. And what we found is that just doesn't work, that things move too fast. As you mentioned, this is where you get into at least the accusations and maybe real potential of suppression of what is protected free speech, or the perception of that. And so I think we've evolved from that now into what we call, free speech with responsibility. And so I think Elon Musk really started this when he took over Twitter, and he said, okay, we're not gonna do content moderation. We want to let free speech reign. But what we need with that is responsibility. Those who post have to be responsible, and that works somewhat. And so I think the evolution, the next step is really now starting to look at what we call education, but also to identify, trusted sources. And maybe later I'll give you an example from the recent elections activity of how the elections community has done that, I think, quite successfully. And then I think the last step, and it's really an evolution, is really what Andy's been doing, is really to embed into our education system, both, in schools, but also for those adults, critical thinking and how you be able to discern whether something is right and truthful and something you can rely upon. So I think that's sort of in a nutshell, sort of what I would view as the evolution.
All right, sure. Thanks, John. And Andy, can you talk about kind of the evolution from your standpoint and maybe why you created your organization?
Yeah. So I've been thinking for a long time about how problematic information spreads through social networks. And long before the internet came along, the madness of crowds was a thing, and it has brought down magnificent civilizations in time. And of course, we'd rather not bring down ours. So um, you have to be thoughtful about the kind of information you take into your mind and rely upon. Not every attempt to filter out the bad stuff amounts to censorship. So we need to be careful not to use the concept of censorship to rule out of bounds all attempts to kind of um, spot the kind of information that's harmful or that is untrue or that is misleading or manipulative. I think we have to start by acknowledging that there is, in fact, information that is objectively problematic. And if you have trouble acknowledging that, just imagine somebody uh, attacking your reputation on the grounds of just complete defamatory lies. You would want recourse, right? You would want some way to say, this can't continue. But how do you do that? How do you minimize the impact of libel, slander, hate speech, um, without crossing the line into censorship? I mean, that's a really interesting and deep philosophical problem. And to tackle it, you have to start with the clear understanding of what a right to speak is. Um, we tend to think of a right as something that overrides every other thing, that it might come into conflict with it. But it turns out that's a wrong conception of what a right is. Um, uh, a right is really something that you have a strong presumption of the freedom to perform, unless there is significantly countervailing considerations. So the famous example is you're not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater. And it would be silly to defend um, your right to yell fire in a crowded theater on First Amendment grounds, right? So the Supreme Court long ago recognized that there are some forms of speech that are unprotected. That's their language. And so if we're going to have a grown-up conversation about this, we need to start with the recognition that even speech rights, as important as they are, have limits. And I'm not saying that because I want to use the concepts of mis and disinformation to suppress anyone's right to dissent. I'm saying that because we need to have a grown-up conversation about whether everyone deserves a megaphone, right? There's a difference between the right to speak and the privilege of having your voice amplified to 100 million followers. But when we equate those two, it becomes impossible to have a nuanced conversation about how to address our mis and disinformation problem.
Right, sure. And social media, has the use of it has grown over the last several years and same as the discord across the country. But can you talk about, besides, Americans, engaging with each other on social media, what are the threats out there? What's the issue, with foreign actors? Why should we still be concerned, aside from our, American discord, and a public social media? Can you talk about the threats, I guess? And John, I'll start with you. Thanks.
Sure. Well, thanks, Kim. Yeah, I think it's gotten a little bit of publicity, but not much, is that our adversaries are aggressively using social media to try to undermine the American way of life, the American systems. And so how do they do this? Well, in some cases, it's actually direct government organizations that are involved in taking divisive issues within the United States and amplifying them. And so they'll, some cases, create, sometimes using artificial intelligence, but they'll amplify the issue to try to create friction. In other cases, and different countries have different objectives. In other cases, they try to undermine confidence in the American systems, our judicial systems, our election systems, et cetera. And this is a real problem. And so one of the things that I think more recently my organization in particular has done is we've worried less about mis and disinformation and more about threats. What are the real threats that we're seeing in internet-based communications, and many of them on social media, where and as we've seen just in the January 1st events, the radicalization of the New Orleans perpetrator online. I mean, that's real. That's happening. Is that the internet is just saturated with this type of information. So what the intent has been is to start to identify what are the threats, where are the adversaries, and then to refer those to appropriate law enforcement. So foreign interference in elections, foreign interference in other areas is illegal and can be prosecuted. And so that is now something that there's increased attention paid for by the government and other organizations to try to get visibility on that, to get this misinformation, which then breeds discontent and in some case violent acts, and get that taken care of.
Just to if I can tack on a thought, the philosopher Karl Popper pointed out that open societies are vulnerable to internal exploitation. So if you want an open society where ideas and information can flow with minimum impediment, you have to be concerned about the use of information to corrupt and undermine the free society itself. Right? How do you prevent the kind of influence campaigns that sow the seeds of destruction of democracy? So democracies all over the world right now are struggling because of the influence operations being carried out by hostile governments. And it's quite clear that if we want to maintain an open society where speech freedoms are respected, we have to deal with this. We can't turn our backs and just say, oh, well, the marketplace of ideas will sort it all out. That's an article of faith that I think we can now hopefully put to rest, because it's just not working.
Right, sure. And John, can you kind of talk about the run up to the 2024 election and kind of how your organization pivoted, to look at kind of those threats? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Just to walk back a bit, in 2020, so my organization runs what we call the Elections Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the EISAC. It's an organization funded by the federal government that is to support the elections community, primarily with cyber related support. So in 2020, the elections officials had asked us for help in dealing with misinformation. And so what we did is set up a process where when they saw factual misinformation, so polling places are wrong, dates are wrong, process descriptions are wrong, they could flag that, send us a summary, and then we would forward it to social media companies and ask them to disposition. And they, some cases did something, some cases didn't. But that activity sort of embroiled us in this whole freedom of speech issue, and quite surprisingly to us. In 2024, we said, well, one, the elections community said, all right, we don't want to get involved in this type of debate. But what the elections community did and we did is working together. One, the elections community did a superb job of the elections officials getting out to the public. This is not something they're used to doing. They're behind the scenes. They just do their job quietly and make sure everything runs well. But they were out in town halls, in forums, on TV, talking about here's our processes, here's the safeguards that we use, here's how we ensure that nothing can go wrong, et cetera, opening up, to those who might be have concerns. And that I think was very effective. Second, what we did was we, working with law enforcement organizations and the elections officials, began to exchange threat information. So as threats became known, we very quickly then were communicating those to law enforcement, and law enforcement and the elections officials had done preparation activities, simulations, they had playbooks. And so on leading up to an election day and immediately after, there was over 100 bomb threats. Those bomb threats were targeted on particular elections locations that were in pivotal organizations. And the impact of these, because of all these preparation activities, was about zero. In the past, that would have shut down that that voting location for a whole day, as they went through and they stormed in with bomb squads, et cetera. Now they knew the elections location was there. They knew it was probably not a true bomb. They came in, they paused the elections for 15, 20 minutes. They went through, they swept the facility, and then they continued. That's a huge success in terms of getting out in front, getting preparation, getting the messages out to the public so that the public had more confidence.
And I'm thrilled to hear John tell that story from the standpoint of somebody who was working that problem on the inside, because there's a narrative afloat right now that organizations like mine are colluding with the government to suppress speech. And this narrative is very seductive, but it's really false. And it's false if you look closely at the kind of story that John just told, and if you actually look closely at the facts. It's certainly possible that efforts to prevent harmful disinformation from spreading can verge into censorship. We should always be vigilant and not allow it to descend into censorship. But we can't just weaponize the concept of censorship, tar everything with a wide brush, and go in guns blazing with accusations. You have to actually take a close look at the way public servants are doing their best in many cases to balance both speech rights and our need for safety and democratic continuity. So these are hard problems, and no absolutist stance on speech is going to solve them for us.
Yeah, let me add just a reflection. As I mentioned, our efforts, my organization's efforts in the 2020 election sort of embroiled us in a number of controversies, and including a suit that was filed by the Missouri and Louisiana attorneys general against a whole set of government officials, and we got dragged in because of our relationship with the government in the election space. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court held, and I was really hoping that they would put a more fine-tuned definition on what constitutes protected free speech, because that was the essence of it. What is protected free speech? They did that a little bit, but what they primarily ruled is the litigants didn't have stature in the case. And so they said based on that, but they did opine in the ruling, and they went to some length to indicate that many of the assertions made in the suit were really, and this really echoes Andy's point, were overstated. They were taking any disagreement with somebody's position as suppression. And they provided examples of, for example, the White House. White House is expected to be a position of bully pulpit. And when they see something that is not going well, is to stand up to that. And so the interaction between White House officials and social media companies, they opined, is something that should be expected. Now, they also said there's a fine line, and the fine line they decided was coercion. And so when you get to the point where you're saying, I'm threatening you, that if you don't abide by what we want, then that could constitute suppression of free speech. But that was as close as they came to the definition. But what was refreshing was that, and most people haven't read the details, is they really said most of what was in the claims really was not suppression of free speech, but they fell short of actually giving us precise definition. So we're going to have to wait for the next case that'll hopefully clarify that, because this is much needed, as Andy said, because right now we're in the eye of the beholder as what constitutes suppression of free speech, and that we waste a lot of energy on that back and forth.
We need a shared objective understanding of what constitutes protected speech, or even just what constitutes falsity, right? It's not, if you imagine that all truth is in the eye of the beholder, then anything goes and it descends into a kind of a free-for-all. So we need to come back to the idea that some forms of information are objectively problematic, and if we have a good faith conversation about what kinds of speech should not be protected, we can arrive in principle at shared standards that serve us all well without suppressing anybody's legitimate right to speak. I would add this, that here's an important thing to remember when engaging with this issue. Remember that calling BS on mis or disinformation is itself protected speech, right? Getting Mark Zuckerberg on the phone and saying, hey, Mark, your platform is spreading a lot of nonsense, that is itself protected speech. So if John's organization was trying to alert the social media platforms to some of the problematic information they were spreading, he was doing so by exercising his speech rights, and should not be regarded as engaged in censorship, certainly not automatically.
Right, sure. And what advice do you have for organizations or institutions to walk this fine line of protecting the First Amendment and free speech while at the same time dealing with misinformation, disinformation, especially, threatening activities by foreign actors? What advice will you have?
So I'll offer a couple of things. And I think first, I would suggest organizations perhaps wind down the emphasis on protected free speech, and the dialogue that has been in sort of the political the media, I think, is overblown, and so I think they really should worry a bit less about the whether or not they are potentially suppressing protected free speech. I think that's, as I said, the Supreme Court case, and there will be other cases. And so I think there's enough legal protections that this is not a real, that doesn't mean you're immune from somebody filing a suit, but I wouldn't worry as much about it. But so that's an aside. I think from a practical standpoint, some of the things that we've seen that work well is, one, get out in front of a potential issue, inform the constituents with factual information. And when you see something that is factually incorrect, use trusted authoritative sources to counter it. That's not a guarantee, but that's going to go a long way. I think there are a number of communities now that are trying to form authoritative sources. So the scientific community, the National Academies just produced a report where one of their main recommendations is we, the scientific community, need to be able to have authoritative sources. When we see that there is a trend toward misinformation, we need to get the scientists, the universities, et cetera, to come together and say, no, that's false. That does not align with the best scientific knowledge that we have. And so I think, and then I guess finally, if there is something that is a threat, if there is, for example, foreign influence, et cetera, reach out to law enforcement. What we're finding is law enforcement is far more knowledgeable today than they were even a couple of years ago about these types of threats, and they're able to mobilize to address them. It's not always as fast as we might like, but in particular, if there's impending danger, we are finding that they can move very quickly with regard to arrests or to suppressing, the source, et cetera, and take advantage of that opportunity.
I would add that I liked John's mention of getting out in front of the mis and disinformation problem. One of the ways I'm trying to make that a reality is through a process called pre-bunking. So you can try to you can try to deal with false information after it's taken root in somebody's mind, and that involves debunking. But that can often be very hard, especially if people become attached to that information and the beliefs that depend on it. The alternative is pre-bunking, and it turns out that if you get there earlier with, say, critical thinking instruction that teaches people how to spot bunk, then the size of the problem diminishes by like an order of magnitude. It's far easier to pre-bunk than to debunk. And by pre-bunk, I mean basically in what cognitive scientists are now calling inoculate against false and manipulative information. So there are certain techniques that every information manipulator uses to hoodwink people, to fool them. And I think every child in America should be taught to keep an eye out for these manipulative forms of information. And with the right kind of instruction, you can help a kid spot these things and grow up in a world where they, with some reliability, trust reliable sources and distrust unreliable sources. And we have a very tall order on our hands to all scale up our skill set in that domain, because the information environment has become several orders of magnitude more complicated just in our lifetimes. But that means we have to get busy and start enriching our mental immune systems and making them more resilient.
Right, sure. And could you point to the resources that your organization offers as far as education and programs and activities?
Yeah, I'll mention the resources we have on our Mental Immunity Project .org website. If you go there, you'll find lots of instructional videos, fun lessons, a guide to strengthening your own mind's resilience and resistance to being fooled. We've tried to make it fun. We're making it easy now for teachers to teach these things in middle schools and high schools and even elementary schools. There are free lesson plans they can download there. And the whole idea is to have a conversations starting at a very young age about what information is genuinely trustworthy and what isn't, and how do you tell the difference? These are questions philosophers have wrestled with for a long time, and it's the kind of question most of us have been able to shove off onto experts for most of our lives. But now people are questioning those experts and whether we should really trust them. And the solution is to go back to these ancient philosophical questions and to have a deep conversation about who to trust and why, and what really constitutes reliable knowledge versus unreliable opinion. These are problems that philosophers have made significant headway on, and by rebooting their discoveries and fashioning them into tools for the modern age, I think we can adapt to this scary new information environment we've created.
Right. I encourage everybody to look at those tools. They're quite useful. And as you both emphasized, it's not just social media, it's anything that's connected to the internet, whether it's your phone or computer or device. And sometimes being hoodwinked is just a click away. And even for somebody, myself, I try to report on cybersecurity and the state of it, and breaches and threats. And I got a text recently, that said it was from the United States Postal Service, that I had a package gone awry and I should click here. And it's funny because I had a package to my niece that we were having an issue with, and I was just about to click, and then I realized, okay, wait a minute, take a step back. Is this real? Is this fake? And it turns out it was fake. And
Beautiful example,
I
Kim.
just phew. But so yeah, that importance of learning those skills, early on, it's very important.
I will add, and I'll be brief here, is that several of the Baltic countries have been working out ways to combat Russian disinformation for over a decade, and they've gotten very good at teaching these things starting in kindergarten. And they're so far ahead of America. If we could just follow their example and update our education system so that every kid knows how to cope with a complex and sometimes sketchy information environment, we would be so much better off.
Right. And do you all have any advice? Obviously, the next big presidential election is, about 4 years away, but do you have advice to the election community, going to the next annual election or biannual election and further down the road to 2028? What do you think, they should be aware of, or institutions should work on?
Well, that's a tall tale.
Yeah.
tall question. So a couple of things I would say. We haven't talked about it much in this discussion, but artificial intelligence is a significantly growing element of the mis and disinformation. And the quality is getting better and better as the artificial intelligence generating tools are getting better. And so we saw during the most recent election that there was a lot of it. And again, the quality in some cases wasn't as good, and the pre-bunking, as Andy said, helped in terms of suppressing it. But it's getting better and better. And so that's going to be a significant concern, because it's increasingly difficult to discern for the American public. And so one of the things my organization's looking at, we have a number of tools that we have procured from vendors to analyze text and speech, et cetera, to identify artificial intelligence. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to see the evolution of real-time analysis to be able to identify artificial intelligence generated materials. In some cases, people are using it for good, but in other cases, they're using it to generate mis and disinformation. So I think that's going to be a major factor. I think the second is we're already seeing it, the diminishing influence of the traditional media sources. And so there's going to be more emphasis on podcasts and social media, et cetera. And there are some, I would think, as we do an after review of the most recent election, that President-elect Trump did a much better job of leveraging those forums than Kamala Harris did. And I think we're going to see that trend continue. And that doesn't necessarily mean the problem gets easier. Perhaps it means it gets harder. I'm hopeful between now and 2028, we'll see more specific legislation or Supreme Court rulings that give us a more fine-grained definition of what should be protected or what should not be protected either way, so that we'll have some guideposts. So that's what I'm looking forward to in the next 4 years.
Right, sure. And Andy?
Here to what John just said.
Yeah, and those were all my questions. Anything else you all wanted to add?
I think that might have been the perfect final word.
Yeah.
I think we're good. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for sharing your expertise and thought leadership. I really appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you.
Thank
John?
you.